Chapter 7. Dinner that evening had been torture. It was silent and deafening at the same time. You could hear a pebble drop, but whispers seemed to waft toward the trio from every direction. Even the adults, with their strict, watchful eyes, seemed to have just stopped murmuring or something every time they looked. Petrick, Suzy, and Barry had quickly finished their meals, gathered their dirty dishes, and walked to the washroom for dish duty. They'd cleaned the pile of dishes they'd been pointed to by the head cook in short order. It was tedious in the extreme, but they had quite a bit of experience, and left swiftly and quietly to go back to their room. The commons had been quiet. The dining hall was at one end of a central path, with dormitories dotting either side of it. The central path led toward the gathering hall, and the front gate on the other end. The trio's dorm was halfway down, right next to a set of paths that split from the central one and ran off in various directions to other parts of the compound. The furthest left to the swimming hole and the watermill, the middle toward the vegetable garden, the second to the right out to the far corner and the treasure shed. Usually, children were out there playing after dinner, chasing each other, waving sticks or rolling stones, but not tonight. Choosing day had been canceled, and the air was thick with tension and grief. The trio didn't light their lanterns as they walked swiftly and silently to their dorm, then up the stairs to their rooms at the top of the building. Nobody stopped them. Petrick had pulled down the attic door and got up immediately. Barry and Suzy shared the room below, and they'd stayed there for a while in silence. Now Suzy was up in Petrick's attic. The lanterns dotted around the room flickered in yellow and orange and cast shadows on the naked rafters. Petrick was working on some gadget, like he always was. She pointed to it. "What is it you're working on right now?" Suzy asked Petrick. He'd been telling her about his ideas for an automatic dishwasher, and she'd been listening while moving around, picking up clothes and papers and other junk that Petrick never seemed to pick up on his own. Petrick looked down at the small cylinder he was holding in his hands. He'd completely forgotten he was holding it. His fingers had been moving on their own, and it was already half assembled. "Oh," he said, "I'm working on Barry's torchless light so he can go back to reading in bed." "My torchless?" Barry called from his bed downstairs. A moment later, his round head popped through the opening in the floor. "Did you fix it?" "Almost," said Petrick. "Just needs these new contacts for the power source. Old ones were too corroded." Barry glanced at Suzy, and they shared a shrug and a look that meant whatever he said. The jargon Petrick used was almost always lost on them. Petrick saw it and shook his head with a smile. "I could teach you guys," he said. "I learn more and more every night." "You mean from the dreams you have with your dad?" said Barry, grunting as he hoisted himself fully into Petrick's room. Clarke plopped down next to him, and Barry joined him on the floor. Petrick nodded. He'd often told them of his dreams. "No thanks," Suzy said. "One sinner in this group is enough for me." "You only half mean that, Suze," Barry said. "Oh, and how do you know that?" "I can hear you asking Petrick all those questions from down there." "Maybe I just like to help him figure out his ideas," she said. With a dramatic flourish to screw the small cylinder tight and a tap on a small metal button, Petrick clicked on a light that was instantly brighter than the sum total of all the flickering lanterns around them. "You did it!" Barry cried, shielding his eyes. Petrick clicked it off again and tossed it gently over to him. "Good as new," he said. "Your dad show you how to make this?" he asked as he ran his fingers gently over its outside. "Kinda," said Petrick. "The basic electrical stuff and bulbs and all that, but I actually designed it on my own with parts from the treasure shed." Barry nodded and shook his head impressed. "It's magical." "Not according to Mistress Frizz," Petrick said with a deep sigh. "What's it like, dreaming of your dad?" Suzy asked. She'd stopped, finally, cleaning the room, and she was sitting on the edge of Petrick's bed. Her short legs dangled off the side. "Yeah," said Barry. "Tell us again what he looks like." Petrick sat down next to Suzy. "Well, he's tall, taller than Master Clarence." Master Clarence was the large, burly adult who ran the horse stables. He could often be heard calling to his animals clear on the other side of the grounds, with a deep voice, but not quite as deep as Master Clarence's, just a little bit higher. "I can imagine that, I think," said Suzy. Me too, said Barry. It's nice. And we're always in the field, together, this open field, and the sun's going down and the moons are rising, and we talk about stuff. Are Suzy and I ever there? Barry asked. No, not that I remember. It's just me and him. Oh. What does he teach you about? Suzy asked. All kinds of stuff. Electricity, gravity, star stuff, all of it. Everything out there that we're missing, stuck here on Indikar. You ever get to see any of that? Barry asked, opening his eyes. Any other planets like Indikar? No, said Petrick. It's only just the meadow. But guys, there's so much out there. My dad's seen it. He's told me about moons made entirely of ice and suns so big they'd fill our whole sky and burn us alive if they were our sun. My dad says we'll get to see it someday when he gets back. All of us. How do you know any of it's real? Suzy asked, opening her eyes too. Petrick looked back at her, confused. If it's just a dream. Well, Petrick paused for a moment. It just feels real. The grass feels real and wet down close to the ground if you touch it, and I've touched him. It feels so real. Plus, I actually learned stuff, that I didn't know before. It has to be real. She nodded and went quiet and thoughtful. It sounds really nice, Petrick, Barry said. You guys think I'm crazy, don't you? There was a pause as Petrick waited for an answer. You guys never have dreams like that? Barry and Suzy shook their heads. Petrick looked at Suzy. Do you ever dream of your dad or mom? Maybe, she said, but I don't remember their faces, so I wouldn't know. Sometimes I feel like I can remember my mom's face, said Barry, if I think really hard. But she died when I was a baby, just like your mom did, Petrick. Petrick nodded. My dad says it was in childbirth. No, thank you, said Suzy with a shudder. Birthing is too dangerous. My dad says it isn't like that out there off Indikar, Petrick said. They have medicines that make it safer. If it's so safe out there, why'd your dad leave you here instead of taking you with him? Barry asked. From the silence that followed, Barry realized he'd been insensitive. Suzy threw a pillow from the bed at him, which missed. He grimaced. I'm sorry, he said. Petrick waved off the apology and motioned for Suzy to stand down the pillow bombardment. No, I'm sorry. I really screwed up today, and then I just ran off. And I'm sorry about that, too. Barry waved a hand. Oh, we knew you weren't going far. You left Clarke behind. Mistress Frizz says I need to think more about how my actions affect you. Old lady and I might be on the same page there, said Barry. Another pillow whistled past his head, which he avoided with a duck. She asked if I ruined choosing day on purpose, Petrick continued. Did you? Suzy asked. This time it was a pillow that whistled past her head. Barry feigned innocence. I don't know, said Petrick, standing up and starting to pace around the room. I mean, is that what you guys want? To go off with one of the childless who you've never met? Doesn't everyone want to be chosen? Barry asked with a frown. I guess, said Petrick. He looked guiltily at his friends. Am I keeping you from that? Suzy launched a pillow straight into Petrick's face. Oh, Crunch, don't be so dramatic, she said. Who needs a family? We have each other. I don't know, said Barry. I'd like a family. What about us? Suzy said, challenging him. Wouldn't you miss us? Barry folded his arms in defiance and placed them on top of his belly. You can't make me feel guilty for something that I feel, Suzy. It's my feeling. But we take care of each other, Suzy countered. Barry shook his head steadfast. No more torchless for reading in bed? Suzy poked further. Or any of Petrick's other fun games and gadgets? Fine, okay, so yes, I would miss you, and I don't want us to be apart. But I also want to be chosen, like I'm a normal person. I can feel both things at the same time, okay? They're not minimally exclusive. Minimally exclusive, Petrick said, correcting him. Exactly, said Barry. Petrick understands, and I accept his apology. We'll get them next time. Just no more flying saucers in front of the grown-ups. There won't be anyway, with the shed gone, said Petrick. Fine, said Suzy. In the meantime, we stick together. Petrick can wait for his dad to come back. Barry can be wait to be hauled away by complete strangers. Okay, said Barry. Don't make it sound terrifying. He snagged a second pillow and flung it towards her, missing wildly. You guys have terrible aim, said Petrick. And I can just cut myself in half if you two ever get chosen, because I'm never leaving either of you guys, Suzy finished. Crunch, Suzy, Barry groaned. He sprang to his feet, ran over to where Suzy was sitting, and tackled her onto the floor. Don't say stuff like that. Stop, she yelled, squirming and giggling under his weight. Clarke began barking at all the commotion. Then she paused and grunted. No, seriously, stop! Everyone stopped. A bell was ringing across the commons. Lanterns out, said Barry, and everyone quickly split up to run around the room and blow out the lights. Once it was dark, the children noticed just how bright the moons were. Their glow poured through the circular window. The stars winked at them. I'm sorry I was so mad at you, Suzy said to Petrick. No, it's okay, he said back. I wasn't thinking. And I'm sorry they're taking away the treasure shed, said Barry. Me too, said Suzy. We'll have to figure something out, Petrick said, eyes filling with the night sky. We always do. Chapter 8. Can you show me how to build my own star drive? It was early in the dream. Fenton was still setting up his lesson for the day. Petrick was standing by the table of materials, running his hands over the wires and gadgets and boxes. Your own star drive? Fenton repeated, with his eyebrows raised. I need to get off Indicar, Dad. Petrick, you can't just run away from home. I wouldn't run away. I'd fly. Petrick pursed his lips. A star drive is incredibly complicated. I bet I can figure it out, said Petrick. I don't mean that as an indictment of your ability, son. I mean that in terms of sheer practicality. Petrick frowned his face into a question mark. Well, first of all, Fenton said, you need Starstuff. I can't refine that here. I need just enough to get off Indicar. No, there's not enough. But Starstuff is in everything. You said so. Straight from the dying suns into me. That's true, but in tiny, tiny, minuscule amounts. Fenton sat himself onto the ground, cross-legged, and invited Petrick to sit next to him. As the boy joined him, he cupped his hands closed, and when he opened them again, there was a gold point of light shimmering in the small space, floating. Petrick reached out to touch it, and his finger passed through it with an electrical tickle. There is star stuff in every atom of your body, Fenton said, in every atom on Indicar, too, but it would take 1,000 Indicars just to distill enough star stuff to hold in my hands. Petrick nodded, remembering. But it's different on the Wandering Giants, those bits of mass you were talking about, where there's more of the particles. Fenton nudged his son in the ribs. So you do pay attention sometimes. That's right. We discovered the first of the starless planets over a millennia ago. They had Starstuff particle concentrations 1 trillion times stronger than ordinary matter. A few tons of ore from the Wandering Giant could power a ship halfway to the outer rim. They changed everything. Until they ran out. Yes. Fenton's face sagged. That's right. Until we used them all up. And that's why you left. Fenton nodded. Petrick looked up at the night sky. How are you going to find the Wandering Giants, he said, if they don't orbit a star? I'm not looking for more of the giants. I'm looking for where they come from. The source. If I get off Indicar, I can help you look for the source. I bet I'd be good at it. I bet you would too, Fenton smiled. I know you would. But you have to stay home, for now. Mistress Frizz says it's dangerous out there. Mistress Frizz has never left the walls of Childers, Fenton scoffed. Is it dangerous? You have to keep your eyes and ears open, Fenton said seriously. Then he grinned and leaned in mischievously. But that's where the adventure is. And besides, you never go on an adventure alone. Fenton pulled open the neck of his shirt and took out a small necklace with a medallion hanging from the end of it. The chain of the necklace was so thin, Petrick had never seen it before. Have I ever told you about the Starfarers? Fenton asked. Yes, Petrick lit up. Let no man stand between me and the stars. Good boy. Well, they also say this. and it's so important to some of them, they wear it around their necks. Fenton extended the small medallion out for Petrick to take into his hands. On one side was a symbol of a shining Starstuff particle and a set of cupped hands, much like his father's had been when he'd shown Petrick the particle. There was a long gash that scored the image at a diagonal. Petrick flipped it over to see the other side. There were 2 words stamped into the metal. "Never alone," Petrick read. He looked up from the phrase at his dad's face. "What does it mean?" "It means a lot of things. It can be an affirmation. As long as you have the Starfarers, you're never alone. Or it can be a cautionary reminder. Never do something alone that should be done together." "What does it mean to you?" As long as I have you, I'm never alone." Petrick smiled and ran his fingers over the words and the gash on the other side. "So you're a Starfarer?" he asked. "No," Fenton said, and the medallion disappeared back inside his shirt. "I was given this as a gift by one." The man's eyes grew wistful, and Petrick prodded him to share whatever he was thinking about. Instead, he got a coy smile. "Maybe someday I'll—" Fenton's face froze mid-sentence. Everything, in fact, was quiet and still, like the world had a power switch and it had been turned off. "Dad?" said Petrick, rising to his feet. There was no response. In the far distance, a low rushing sound crept into his awareness. Petrick strained to hear it and searched the empty meadow for the source. "Dad, you hear that?" Fenton did not respond. He could not hear him. The sound was growing louder, and it took shape as a droning whir, or was it a buzz? Petrick walked a few paces from his frozen father as the buzzing grew louder. His vision telescoped, the periphery of the world contracted, and Petrick felt suddenly sick to his stomach. It was as if the air was crushing in upon him in invisible spikes, and suddenly it was hard for him to breathe. The buzz was now a roar. He realized he'd closed his eyes and stumbled to the ground. When he opened them and staggered back to his feet, he saw an enormous cloud of glow hornets that filled the distorted sky. Glow hornets were a summer fixture on Indikar, beautiful and mesmerizing from afar when their glowing abdomens were tracing lines of light in the night sky, but fearsome and dangerous when they swarmed. This was a larger swarm than the boy had ever seen. The angry cloud of them rushed down with a stabbing synchronicity toward the frozen Fenton. "Dad!" Petrick yelled. The glow hornets enveloped his head and upper torso. Their orange glowing abdomens traced angry lines. A nest of light, they moved so quickly. The hornets awakened Fenton as if he were an automaton, and he stood stiffly, unnaturally. The hornets rose with his head. Their roar was deafening. Fenton snapped his face to his son, and Petrick saw that his eyes glowed the same orange as the hornets. Petrick stumbled again to the ground. The weight of the crushing world was heavy on his chest, and Petrick felt as though he might puke. The possessed Fenton's mouth moved, but Petrick shook his head in desperation. "I can't hear you!" Fenton repeated the motion, but the only thing Petrick could hear was the roar. He squeezed his chest closed tight as a wave of nausea crested. He screamed aloud when he opened them again. His father's face was suddenly inches from his. The hornets rushing between them were deafening. Petrick raised his arms reflexively to protect himself. "Help me!" Fenton pleaded. His eyes were smoldering suns. "Help me!" Petrick gasped awake for the second time in as many nights to Clarke's furious barking at the foot of his bed. This time, however, it was still night. His head was swirling with a sharp headache, and Clarke was not himself. Petrick couldn't be sure if it was leftover delirium, but he could swear the small furball's eyes shone for a second with the same orange fury as the glow hornets in the dream. He looked like he was ready to explode. The barking was incessant and insistent, with a different tenor than Petrick had ever heard. It assaulted his ears, which made the pounding in his head worsen, and he felt suddenly as if he might be sick. Petrick let the wave of nausea pass and dared to stand. Seeing that Petrick was now awake, Clarke jumped off the bed and ran over to the attic door leading down into Barry and Suzy's room. There he proceeded to punctuate each of his barks with several rapid-fire paw scratches at the attic door. Those turned into furious, fastest-possible digging. "Clarke!" said Petrick, the pain in his head making him feel woozy. "Stop it!" The dog did not hear him, or chose to ignore the command. Downstairs, Petrick could make out the sounds of Suzy and Barry stirring. Petrick stumbled towards the possessed Clarke. "What is it?" he asked. Clarke looked directly at him, barked a single bark, and then started pawing again at the door. The message was crystal clear, although Petrick couldn't fathom the reason for it. He lifted the latch to the attic door, and the stairs swung downward. Clarke, as Petrick instinctually knew he would, immediately bounded down the stairs and ran straight over to the closed door that led out of the bedroom into the hallway. There, he immediately started barking and pawing again. Petrick followed after him to find Suzy and Barry sitting up in their beds. "What's going on?" asked Suzy, wide-eyed and awake. "I don't know." Petrick was mid-stride, moving toward Clarke. "He just started barking like crazy all of a sudden." Petrick paused once he reached the door leading to the hallway, considering for a second whether or not it was wise to actually let Clarke out. But the dog sensed his master's hesitation and resumed his barking and pawing. It worked. Petrick opened the door rather than have his barking wake up the entire building. Clarke bolted down the hallway, and then down the stairs in seconds. "Clarke!" Petrick called in vain, feeling very foolish. "Guys, we have to go after Clarke. He's gone crazy or something." "You go get him," said Barry, flopping himself back down onto his pillow. Clarke began barking downstairs, and Petrick felt a stab of pain in his forehead. More intense than the others, an overwhelming thought filled his head. I must go after him. "Petrick?" He must have fallen because he was suddenly looking up at Suzy and Barry's worried faces. "Are you okay?" Suzy asked. "You kind of just moaned and fell, and then you didn't answer." "We have to go after Clarke," insisted Petrick, scrambling up to his feet and saying aloud the only thought he could hold on to. "He'll get in trouble if we don't get him to stop." Petrick jammed his feet into a pair of canvas slippers that he kept by the doorway, and Barry and Suzy did the same without further protest. Petrick's headache seemed to subside as soon as the trio were traipsing down the stairs toward Clarke's racket. When they reached the ground floor landing, they were surprised to see Clarke outside already. He had turned and was looking toward them through one of the open front windows, which had been cracked to let in the summer breeze and had provided the canine with his escape route. He stopped his barking as soon as he caught sight of his master. Clarke was several paces away from the dorm house, but he hadn't run off as Petrick had expected. There he was, turned back toward them, waiting, like he was waiting for them. Petrick was first to the front door, and he opened it to allow the three of them onto the outside porch. "Clarke!" Petrick hissed as loud as he dared. "Get back inside!" Clarke's response was to turn tail and take off out of the commons like a shot from a cannon. "Ugh," Barry Whisper groaned. "We're going to get in trouble." Again, Petrick's head felt like it was going to split open, and his mind screamed at him. I must go after him. He shook off an attempt from Suzy to steady him, leapt off the porch, and started off running in the direction in which Clarke had disappeared. The motion of his steps seemed to relieve the pain, and his senses cleared somewhat. "Come on, guys!" He motioned back towards Barry and Suzy. Another nervous groan from Barry, and the shuffling of feet told him that they were following. The trio left the confines of the commons, and the several paths that led to the various sections of the Childers compound stretched out in front of them. Clarke could have quickly disappeared down any of those paths, leaving his humans to scratch their heads and guess, but instead they saw him just ahead in the moonlight, again with his head turned back, looking at them. He barked just as he had before, and then took off up a path that our trio knew very well indeed. "He's leading us out toward the treasure shed," Petrick called back as he continued his jogging pace. "Why?" Barry asked breathlessly from behind. Petrick noticed his pack bouncing ridiculously up and down on his back. "Why would he do that?" Petrick didn't have the opportunity to speculate. Some muffled noises behind the group made Petrick turn his head around to look back at where they'd just come from. Beyond Suzy's speeding legs and Barry's huffing and puffing, a lantern had lit up in one of the adult dorms. They'd indeed woken at least one of the adults up, a couple of them, if Petrick accurately saw the shadowed figures behind the backlit curtains. They were going to be in trouble for being out after curfew. There was no way around that now, so Petrick put it out of his mind. He wasn't just going to let Clarke run off into the night alone. They reached their familiar corner of Childers, and all three stopped, breathing heavily. As they looked around, the colorless light of the moons made the hulking structures around them much more mysterious and menacing, like monsters frozen in the shadows. "It's creepy out here in the dark," confirmed Barry. "Where's Clarke?" Petrick asked, scanning around for the naughty dog. "I don't see him." "Me either," said Barry, looking around. "What happened?" "I don't know," Petrick said. "I had a nightmare. I woke up, and Clarke was—" "Shh," Suzy said to the two boys, and cocked her ear to listen. A digging sound, over by the collapsed treasure shed, wafted above the noise of the crickets and the tree frogs. "I hear it," Petrick said to Suzy. "The back room of the shed, by the wall." The trio ran to the twisted pile that was all that was left of the treasure shed, and slowed as they approached, keenly aware that they were in slippers, not shoes. There were sure to be glass, nails, and various other nasty pointy bits scattered about. "How are we going to get in?" said Barry. Petrick dropped down to his hands and knees and peered into the tangled mess as best he could in the pale light. "There was a space just big enough earlier to get through to the back," he said, but as bright as the moons were, the shed was still a thicket of inky and impenetrable black shadows. "Clarke!" called Suzy as quietly as she could. "Come on out here!" Petrick slapped a hand down in the dust. "It's too dark," he said. "We're never going to see anything." A small beam of light clicked on behind him on cue. Petrick turned around to see Barry standing there, freshly repaired torchless in hand. Barry shrugged, unperturbed. "Never know when I might need it," he said. Suzy threw her hands up. "Why didn't you pull it out sooner? We could have stabbed our feet 100 times out here already." "Because the adults might see the light and find us?" Barry answered. Suzy lifted her chin and nodded. "Oh, yep, that makes complete sense. Good call." "I can see the crawl space," Petrick cried out. It was much tighter than before, but it was still there. "Shh!" Suzy and Barry both hissed at him. He nodded and brought up a finger to his lips. "We have to crawl on our bellies, but we'll make it. We'll have to crawl on our bellies, but we can make it. Just watch out for sharp stuff." He pointed to an opening in the middle of the rubble and proceeded to shimmy himself inside. Suzy followed, and Barry brought up the rear, his small light illuminating the way ahead. Petrick grunted as he slid past a particularly low-fallen beam, then stopped as he felt a pull on the back of his nightshirt. It had caught on a shard of glass sticking out from a broken window frame. He freed himself with a yank and a rip. "Careful of that," he called back, pointing at the shard. "Back shouldn't be much farther." Sure enough, the light from Barry's torchless caught a glint of metal shelving a moment later, and Petrick was able to rise from his hands and knees to a squatting position and move aside to let Suzy and Barry shimmy their way through. "This place is done for," Suzy said with a tinge of sadness, as Barry played his light over the last remains of the back of the shed. The roof had caved in, crushing most of the shelves. Their electrical and mechanical bounty was piled on the floor. There was nowhere left to stand. "Where is Clarke?" Petrick asked. The digging sound had stopped. Barry moved his light to the back stone wall the shed had been built against. "Would you look at that?" he cried. Clarke had been pawing furiously at what used to be the small opening in the exterior wall that surrounded all of Childers. The final collapse of the shed had knocked several more of the bricks out. It was now a gaping hole, perhaps large enough to slip through. As they spotted him, Clarke jerked his head up, and his muzzle and paws were covered in dirt, the hair on his head wildly askew. But again, it was his eyes that were most distinct. They seemed to glow for a moment in the darkness. Clarke barked at Petrick, and then he was off through the hole in the wall before any of the three of them could even lunge forward to try and catch him. "Clarke!" Petrick said in vain. A sound from the outside, muffled voices, made all three of them look back. Through the old glass of a single uncrushed window, they could see two floating yellow-orange points of light bobbing outside. They were lanterns, which meant the adults had followed them. They were heading directly for the shed. "We're going to be in such big trouble," said Barry. And that's the end of chapter 8. Okay. Thank you guys so much for tuning in again today. We made some good progress today. That was chapters 7 and 8. And tomorrow I'll be back with chapters 9 and 10. And we'll pick up with just what in the stars is going on with Clarke, where he's running to, and whether or not those adults are going to get our heroes in even more trouble than they used to be. Thank you so much for joining. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.